Hello all. Last week we saw a report on inflation being released by Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. The inflation rate was a bit high than the expected rate, and we also saw the sovereign credit rating agency Fitch giving a credit rating for India. So these are the two current affairs that we will be discussing today. This is weekly current affairs session by Amrita IAS Academy. My name is 𝐼𝐴. Let's delve deep. Recently, Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation released the inflation rate for the month of July, which is 4.45. The expectations of the inflation rate will be given out by RBI, but the actual inflation rate on the ground was seen to be a bit high than the expectation. And if we compare the inflation rate of the last month, the June inflation was somewhere around 4.38%. So the 4.45% of inflation, it is the second consecutive month where the inflation has been high, and this is the highest inflation rate in the past 19 months. So it is above RBI target. So now we will see why there has been a rise in the inflation rate than the RBI target, one thing, and we will see why the inflation has been higher than the expectations that were given out by RBI. What are the ground reasons or realities that led to a rise in inflation rate, and what are the factors that can lead to a rise in inflation. So basically, inflation in July has been 4.45%. In June, it was 4.38%. And if we look at food inflation, it has also been high at 5.52% when compared with the June food inflation of 5.32%. So primarily, the inflation rate was driven up by the food inflation. If we look at the causes of food inflation, there are some factors that led to a rise in food inflation. If we look at the global prices of food, there has been a surge in global prices of food, not just our common vegetables and fruits. There has been a rise in the price of pulses and cereals. So that global price rise has been reflected in food inflation in Indian context as well. And if we look at the monsoon data for the past 2-3 months, in June there has been a monsoon which is 40% lower than the normal rate. So a lower monsoon was reported in the month of June recently, but in the month of July and in the month of August there has been some revival of monsoon, but the lower level of monsoons in June month has contributed to a rise in inflation. And we also had some experiences of El Nino effects that also had contributed to a rise in food inflation. So El Nino effects was there and a global surge in food prices. So all these factors combined contributed to a rise in food inflation, and the rise in food inflation is the primary driver of the inflation in the whole of economy. So these are the reasons, as I mentioned. There has been a global rise in food prices, monsoon deficiency and El Nino effects. All these things combinedly contributed to a rise in food inflation, which is further reflected as a rise in inflation at 4.45% in the month of July. So now inflation is of two types. There are two types of inflation. One is headline inflation and the other one is core inflation. Headline inflation, it measures the total inflation in the economy. On the other hand, while we are concerned about core inflation measures the inflation that excludes food and fuel prices. So core inflation excludes food and fuel prices, and headline inflation, it includes inflation of the economy in general, which includes food and fuel prices. So since headline inflation includes food and fuel prices, it is highly volatile. Volatility means it changes very rapidly. So this high volatility is basically a result of inclusion of food and fuel prices. On the other hand, core inflation, which does not include food and fuel prices, is more stable. And headline inflation is used by common man, me, you, everybody. We assess the inflation rate based on this headline inflation, while core inflation, it is used by banks for policy changes. In our case, in Indian context, Reserve Bank of India uses this core inflation to assess the policy changes or policy rates, which are repo rate, reverse repo rate. All these, if at all any changes has to be brought in these policy rates, it will be based on the observation of core inflation. And headline inflation, it shows the cost of living. Since it includes almost all commodities that are required for living of any citizen or any human being, it shows the cost of living for any person. On the other hand, core inflation shows the structural changes in the economy, how much change is happening and how this change is contributing to a price rise in the economy. So, when we are looking at the rate of inflation, there is a constant rise and fall of the inflation. It is a common phenomena in the economy. And this rise and fall of inflation are caused mainly by demand side factors and supply side factors. Now we will see what demand side factors are first. So demand side factors or demand pull inflation is an inflation that is caused by an increase in demand. There is a huge rise in demand, and due to this increased rise and the supply being constant. See, for example, if there is production of pens which is 100 units, there is 100 units of pen that is being produced every month. But suddenly, due to an unknown reason, there has been a surge in demand for pens. Previously, since till last month, there was a demand which is more or less equal to 100 units, somewhere around 90 units or 100 units of pen would be demanded in the economy. But there has been a sudden surge in this demand, somewhere up by 50 units or 200 units. This is the supply, and the demand has increased to somewhere around 200 units. The reason be unknown. So now, because there is an increased demand and a fixed supply, there is a scarcity in the economy. There's a scarcity of pen in the economy. Due to the scarcity, there will be price rise. There will be rise in price of pen. So, due to the scarcity, there will be an inflation generated in the economy. So, due to the demand side factors, inflation is on rise in the economy. So, this is demand pull inflation. Any further factors, any factors that causes a rise in price because there is a surge in demand. So, this is what is demand pull inflation. So, it happens when the overall demand for goods and services in the economy grows faster than production capacity. It is often described as too much money chasing too few goods. People will be ready to buy the goods. People will be ready to buy commodities. They are ready to pay the price, but the commodities are limited. Here, the supply of pen is remaining stagnant at 100 units, but people are ready to pay more for the pen, and hence there is a rise in inflation. So, such an inflation is called demand pull inflation. And the reasons can be more consumer spending. As the case of pen, people decided to spend more on pens, and hence there is a rise in demand. So, consumer spending, when it rises, there can be an inflation due to the demand side factors. So, that can trigger demand pull inflation, or there is higher government spending. See, government spending is part of fiscal policy. So when the fiscal policy, when the fiscal expenditure is on a rise, there is an expansionary fiscal policy. When there is an expansionary fiscal policy, the government is deciding to roll out more money into the market. So this is expansionary fiscal policy. Fiscal policy are those policies that are related to the government, and when the government decides to spend more, we call it as expansionary fiscal policy. So when there is expansionary fiscal policy, government will be spending more and more money will come into the market. So there will be injection of cash into the market through public projects or state investments. So people will be having more money in their hands because the government decided to spend more money. So this also can trigger demand pull inflation. Next is lower interest rate. See, people invest in bonds only when they get a higher incentive, which is a higher interest rate. Now, when there is low interest rate, they won't be incentivized to invest in bonds. Rather than investing for a low return, they will decide to spend more today. Every investment that we do today is a sacrifice. How? It is a sacrifice of our current expenditure. We are sacrificing our current expenditure and investing in bonds. So, when there are low interest rates existing in the economy, people won't be incentivized to invest in bonds. So, cheaper borrowing lets people and business spend and invest more. So, when there are low interest rate, people will spend more. That can lead to demand pull inflation. And then there is export growth. When there is high export from the economy, there is high demand for export commodities, that can create local stock deficiency or scarcity. So there is a scarcity of supply side, and people are also getting more money from rise in export. All these factors combined can also contribute to rise in demand pull inflation. More money supply. When money comes into the economy through a rise in money supply, when the RBI or the central bank decides to roll out more money or inject more cash into the market, that will lead to people having more cash in their hands and in effect leading to higher demand. So people will have more cash, there will be increased money supply, more cash in hand, more demand, that can lead to higher inflation, which is demand pull inflation. So all these reasons can contribute to demand pull inflation if the inflation is driven by demand side factors in the economy. Now coming to the supply side factor, it is called cost push inflation. So when the overall prices go up, making things cost more, it is some issues or deficiencies on the supply side that reflects as a higher cost in the market. This is known as cost push inflation. Obstacles or bottlenecks in the supply side can cause cost push inflation. Suppose a very recent example that we can quote is the disruption of Strait of Hormuz. There was a disruption of transportation through the Strait of Hormuz. We had some issues in the Strait of Hormuz due to US-Iran war, and that disrupted almost all kind of transportation that was happening through the Strait of Hormuz, and that caused a rupture of the supply chain. So there was not enough commodities that were receiving into the economy, and immediately it was reflected in the market prices as an increase in gas prices, as an increase in vegetable prices. We could feel it. We all felt it. So this is called cost push inflation. And the reasons for cost push inflation can be a higher raw material prices. When the prices of the raw materials rises, that can lead to inflation. A very recent example can be the rise in prices of mobile phones due to China blocking the export of rare earth metals. So chip manufacturing was at some kind of bottlenecks, and that resulted as a rise in prices of mobile phones. Then rising wages, if people in the industry, they are demanding more wages, they have to be given more labor charge, they have to be given more wages. That can reflect in the commodity price as a higher charge, which can be reflected in the economy as a higher inflation rate. And when there are supply chain disruptions due to natural calamities, war or trade blocks, as I said, there was disruption of Strait of Hormuz during the Iran-US war, and that resulted in cost push inflation in our economy. That is a very best example that we can quote for supply chain disruptions. And when there are higher taxes or regulations. So when there is extra government fee, there is extra fee levied by the government or compliance rules that forces business to spend more. They are spending more. So that will be also reflected in the price of commodities as higher prices. All these factors can contribute to supply side disruptions, and it will be reflected as cost push inflation in the economy. So now the general question is inflation good or bad? The answer lies somewhere in the middle. Now the question is inflation good or bad for the economy? See, the answer lies somewhere in the middle. It should be a balance. Too much inflation or too low inflation, both are harmful for the health of the economy. So a too high inflation, which is known as hyperinflation, it leads people to hoarding and stockpiling. Basically, when there is very high inflation, suppose the price of onions go up or the price of pens go up, people start hoarding these commodities. Hoarding means they start stocking these commodities in anticipation that the prices may go further up in the future. And this expectation will drive them to stock the commodities or hoard the commodities. So this will lead to a scarcity of these goods in the market. Automatically, any scarcity of commodities will lead to a rise in its prices, and further inflation will be triggered in the economy. So this leads to a fall in value of currency. Even if you have 1000 rupee or 2000 rupee, you are not able to achieve your necessary demands because the value of money you have at hand is declining due to rising inflation. So way too high inflation, cash will become worthless and people will lose their life savings. So every rise in inflation is actually a lose in value of your currency. So very high inflation can lead to worthlessness of currency, and that can lead to lower purchasing power. When currency becomes valueless or when the value of currency becomes very low, purchasing power will be affected. So too high inflation is not good for the economy. Now what happens when the inflation is too low? When the inflation is too low, prices of goods and services move either very slowly or they do not move at all. So again, expectation come into play. When the prices of commodities is too low, people expect that the price of commodities will fall further, and hence they hold their spending. So when the inflation is too high, people hold the commodities in the expectation that price will rise in the future, and when the inflation is too low, people will expect prices to fall further, and hence they hold their spending. So they hold off their purchases and they expect the prices to fall further in the future. This in totality will cause a very low consumer spending, and that will further result in a spiral only. The economy won't revive without consumer spending. So in reality, there should be a balance of inflation. That is why the government has set a target of 4 plus or minus 2 inflation bracket. Inflation can be contained within a range of 2 to 6%, ideally 4%, and this is the inflation bracket. That is why the government has set a target of 4 plus or minus 2, and RBI strives to maintain this inflation target. Now let us move to the next topic. Fitch retains India's BBB minus rating on robust growth outlook, flags physical risk from youth protests. So, we will see what this BBB minus rating is. So, it is basically a rating given to our sovereign credits. So, this is basically called sovereign credit rating. And Fitch is a company which gives out sovereign credit ratings, and India was given BBB minus, which is the lowest investment grade, and that has been stagnant or stable for the past 20 years. Since 2006, this has been our rating, BBB minus. So, now we will see what sovereign credit rating is. So, sovereign credit rating, it is an independent evaluation of a country's credit worthiness, which helps investors assess the risk associated with investing in country's debt. It is basically assessing how well the country is doing in managing its credit. Is it paying back its debts? Is it very regular? Is the country paying the ample amount of money that is to be paid as interest rate? Or is the country in a risk? Is the country not able to pay off its debts? Is the country falling further into debt? These are the kind of things that sovereign credit rating evaluates. And based on these parameters, the credit rating agencies, just like Fitch, these agencies give a grade, and this actually acts as a indicator or guide for investors to decide whether to invest or not to invest in the country. So, sovereign credit ratings, they are not by any government, institutes or organization, but rather they are independent assessments by some agencies. So, basically investors use these credit ratings to assess the riskiness. So, it acts as a progress card. Okay, it acts as a progress card which indicate to an investor whether to invest or not invest in a country. So, developing countries that want to access funding in international bond markets seek good sovereign credit ratings. Any country will be very happy to invite investors into their country. So, if they want to invite investors, they should actually maintain a good sovereign credit rating so that investors will automatically come. They feel that this is a safe place to park my investments, safe place to park my savings, and I will get good returns or fair returns, and hence they will be attracted to come into the country. And if any country wants to leverage the investments, they have to have a good sovereign credit ratings. So, credit rating agencies evaluate a nation's economic environment and political risk to determine a rating for it. So, if a country is going through political instabilities, that will be reflected in the sovereign credit ratings. So, FDI inflow or outflow can be determined through this sovereign credit ratings. Standard & Poor, Moody's, Fitch ratings are three most influential agencies. As I told you earlier, these are done by independent agencies. So, they are private companies. So, Standard & Poor's, Moody's and Fitch are three famous credit rating agencies, and Fitch gave a BBB minus or higher rating to countries it considers investment grade. India has now received a BBB minus credit rating, which says that India is safe for investment, and grades of BBB plus or lower are deemed to be speculative or junk. They are not good for investment. So, if we look at the scenario, which gave Argentina a CC grade in 2023, which says that Argentina is not very good country for investment, and Chile maintained an A minus rating. So, these basically act as a progress card. It acts as a guide for the investor whether to invest in the country or not. As far as India is concerned, India got a BBB minus, which is an investment grade, and hence it is safe for a country. It is safe for our country to attract investments, and investors also will be happy to come and invest in the country. So the government also, they give more importance to this credit rating just because it can have an impact on the interest rate on government bonds. So how these sovereign credit ratings will have an impact on the government bonds? See, when the credit rating agencies give a good rating to a government bond, it means that bond is good or the country is good, it is safe for investment, and there is chances of very few risk. The risks factor is very low. So people will be interested because there is low risk. And when the ratings are high, it indicates that there is low risk in the country. That will act as a progress card and it will attract investors and bring in more investments into the country. And hence, credit rating is something very important for the economy as well as for the government to attract investments. So these are the two interesting in current affairs that we discussed today. I hope this helps you in your preparation. Thank you.
Amrita IAS Academy.